So I'm just going to quickly begin. I know many of you probably are familiar with Love is Moving, but for those of you who aren't, I'm just going to quickly tell you a little bit about it. So Love is Moving is a national magazine across Canada. We have print and online publication, and it is geared towards Canadian Christian young adults. So we have a community of readers and writers who are young adults and who write about topics related to faith and Canadian culture. And so if you haven't already, you can subscribe to the magazine, which is free in Canada, or you can subscribe to our email newsletter. You can find the information for both of those at www.loveismoving.ca. And in our summer issue, which many of you probably have already received, it was released in July. The theme was on sports and faith. And so after tonight's conversation, you might want to check out more of the articles from the issue. We had articles written by our panelists in today's conversation, as well as our columnist and one of my co-hosts, Josh Thiessen. Ivanka wrote an article about her experience creating art in response to the war in Ukraine. And Josh interviewed a photographer and visual artist, Malik Dalaman, and Andrea wrote a column on the blessings and challenges of multi-ethnic churches. So you can find all those pieces online on our website. So I'm gonna pass over the virtual mic to Nadine to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Nadine Iraguha, and I'm new with Love is Moving. I'm the Community Relations Coordinator. And yeah, I've had the privilege to work for Love is Moving for the past month. And so tonight we'll be hosting the panelists, Andrea and Galadza, Ivanka. I hope I said the last name right. So I would like now to invite Andrea to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Andrea Nwabuike. I've been writing the column Church of Many Cultures for the past year or so with Love is Moving. I've also contributed to a couple of other publications. I primarily focus on writing about the intersections of race, faith, and gender, and ethnicity. But my 9-to-5 job is as a psychotherapist at Toronto Metropolitan University. So it's great to be here today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Andrea. Now I would like to also invite Ivanka Galadza to introduce herself briefly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ivanka. I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. I live here in Ottawa with my husband, who is actually away doing his military training this summer. But I think I see him here. He's joined our discussion. So just a little bit about my family history, because I think it's relevant to our conversation. So my grandparents came to the States as refugees from Ukraine during World War II. So the rest of my family are Americans, while I was born here in Canada. But that being said, my parents, who might also be here during this panel, they did an amazing job of kind of raising us kids to speak Ukrainian and to maintain a strong link to our culture, and also to our Christian heritage, which is so intertwined with Ukrainian culture and history as well. So as an illustrator, I kind of try to honor that in my work. I recently completed a graphic novel about the famine genocide that happened in Ukraine in the 1930s. It's going to be published this November, so keep an eye out. And I've created a series of drawings portraying events during this current war on Ukraine, which were sold to raise money for humanitarian aid through a project that I co-founded called Project Sunflower Ukraine. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that all in a bit, and I'll include links in the chat later on. So that's me.
Thanks both. Josh, I'll pass it over to you to kind of frame our conversation.
Yeah, my name is Josh Thiessen, and I'm a fine artist. And as Elena mentioned, a columnist at Love is Moving magazine. And I've had the privilege of helping organize these virtual Zoom discussions and participating in the EFC's new Creators Collective initiative. Now, in order to frame this topic tonight, I thought I'd ask a question. Has anyone ever said that you're a tortured artist, maybe a tortured soul? Well, I know I've been called that. And oftentimes people say that artists are just too sensitive to all the evils in this world. I find that creative types tend to feel things on a deeper emotional level than most people, and we're often labeled melodramatic for it. But I don't think that this should be seen as our weakness, but it should actually be seen as our strength, because over the years, whether it be addressing racial injustices or human rights and freedoms or tragic wars, artists have often been the first to respond with keen sensitivity to the crises of our day. So in biblical history, the Hebrew people had this tradition of lamenting evil and suffering in this world through poetry and psalm. So 67 of the 150 Psalms are actually Psalms of lament. Actually, Jesus quotes from one of those Psalms, Psalm 22, while he's on the cross, and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So while Jesus' atoning sacrifice and victory over death grants us the hope of eternal life, we have to remember that he experienced the full extent of a broken world. As we read in the book of Romans, the Holy Spirit groans for us when we don't have the words to say. And it says in Psalms 34 that the Father is close to those who are brokenhearted and crushed in spirit. There's this Russian filmmaker named Andrei Tarkovsky, and he states that the artist exists because the world is not perfect. Art would be useless if the world were perfect, as man wouldn't look for harmony, but would simply live in it. In my view, the role of the artist is to be a suffering prophet, being able to expose the fallenness of this world, but also be able to visualize through a hopeful imagination its redemption. And throughout history, artists have often been the key agents for social change. And as Christians, we're called to be ministers of reconciliation. So I think naturally the art that comes out of us should reflect that deep desire we have for the world to be set right by our Creator. During a pandemic or an economic downturn, art isn't deemed, essential service. But as many of you know, art making is very therapeutic. And it makes bleak times a lot more bearable. I believe that art is a God-given gift to humanity. It can be a spiritual practice which can change the way we view the world. Much like the Psalms of Lament, the arts can be a healthy way for us to process grief and suffering. But as we're going to talk about tonight, the ways that each of us individually respond to crisis is going to be different. And that's okay, because we all play unique roles in the kingdom of God. Well, I'm going to pass it over to my co-host, Alana Reimer, and she's going to interview our special guests tonight, Ivanka and Andrea.
Thanks, Josh. I feel like I'm going to have to think over what you said for a little bit. There's a lot there. So I'm going to start off with a question for either of you, and whoever wants to jump in first, you can do rock, paper, scissors or whatever. Probably wouldn't work very well over Zoom. But how has art helped you share your story or process something, perhaps in an especially difficult moment in your life?
Well, I see that I unmuted myself first. So Andrea, is that okay if I go first? Okay. So in my case, I'm better at getting an idea across through a drawn image rather than words. I leave the word writing to Andrea. So I've kind of taken advantage of that skill in order to share those thoughts through illustrations, which I think has been resonating with a lot of other people, because after all, we're very visual creatures, us humans. So drawing these little vignettes of other people's lives and their stories is kind of my way of adding to the collection of our shared history. And this will all make a lot more sense if you take a look at my Instagram and read through the background stories behind each illustration, which I think will add links to our social media accounts later. Is that correct? Yeah. And also on another note, I think creating a visual representation of how you're feeling can sometimes be easier, can be an easier way to cope with a crisis than directly talking about it with someone when the wound is still fresh or the trauma is still ongoing. And I think art making has helped me to grapple with some feelings of my own about the war, about Ukraine's history. So I can see how something like art therapy, for example, would be an extremely effective method of working through those issues. So I guess to sum that up, I think there's kind of a private realm of art making and a public realm where one is more maybe cathartic and for yourself, and the other is more for maybe raising awareness or keeping a record for historical events, something like that. So.
Yeah, for myself, I think during the height of the pandemic, we were also witnessing the racial pandemic within the United States and kind of the rest of the world as well. So being trapped at home and then having access to these images and videos of violence perpetrated on people that look like me, that look like my family members, that was hard to sit with, but then also to see the types of conversations that we're having. So it was very political, kind of theologizing about what was happening, but not really giving space for people to grieve or for people to see the humanity of the people on the other ends of the screen. So for me, to be able to sit down and to write poetry was a way of being able to kind of cut through the political noise and the theologizing of the issue, and to just talk about the human emotion that was kind of underneath all of that. And I think there are things that you can say in poetry that just don't come across as well in a conversation or even in a written blog post. So I found that just having that space to write more creatively, to write poetry that I didn't even share with others, but that just allowed me to kind of process what I was experiencing and witnessing. That was really important for me to do, especially as the kind of connections that we had within the pandemic were changed in a lot of different ways. So yeah, that's kind of my personal experience.
You both kind of touch on sharing things publicly and also sharing things or working on things privately as a way of processing. So I wonder how you each discern the process of what is a personal something to process and what is something that is actually worth sharing for the sake of grieving together or processing something more publicly.
Okay, so for myself, I think when I have a little bit more of a sense of organization of my own emotions or the narrative or my thoughts, then I feel like I'm in a better position to share whatever I've created or even to have more of a dialogue with others. But if it still feels like it's disorganized or scattered, or if it feels kind of too fresh that I haven't really processed or kind of done that kind of initial first aid work within myself, then that's a good sign for me to kind of hold things in or to rely on kind of those deeper, more trusted relationships and process in there before I share something more widely.
Yeah, I totally agree with Andrea. And I think that also as artists, as professional artists, not just kind of hobbyists, we owe it to people to offer something of quality. and not just kind of a what's it called? Maybe a verbal or a visual kind of, you know, the word I'm thinking of.
Verbal vomit.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I wanted to say that, but yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think there's that added element of discernment before putting something out into the public that we need to keep in mind.
Ivanka, you've touched on this a little bit already, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the work that you've been doing over the last several months, starting, I believe, pretty soon after the war started in Ukraine. You began sharing. Obviously, these pieces are very personal to you, and this isn't something where you get to write from the scars, like you're writing from wounds, right? I wonder if you could just share about what that's been like, and maybe even what the response has been, or how you reflect on that now that you've been doing this for a few months.
Yeah, I think the illustrations that I've been making kind of depict the symptoms and the repercussions of like the overall tragedy of war, but their purpose really is to bring hope, not just to those people viewing them, but to myself as well, like as I'm making them. And I'm often reminded of my grandparents' stories of escaping their war-torn country of Ukraine, or of my great aunts and uncles who were exiled to Siberia and trying to survive there. So this whole series of drawings that I've been doing since the war started in February really arose out of necessity and inspiration. So like I needed to make this artwork precisely because it was so personal. And it also felt necessary, and it felt good to then further develop that series into a project where money was raised and given to refugees or toward medical attention for injured soldiers or pregnant mothers in need. And in fact, one of the organizations we raised money for is UNHCR. And that was the same organization that helped settle my grandparents in America. Back then it was known as the UN Refugee Agency. So I know, well, I hope that my grandparents would be proud of me for using my talents, maybe not just for self-expression, but maybe more importantly, to tell the stories of the persecuted and the suffering, and to help them in the way that I uniquely can. And about your question about the response that I've been getting, I've been really, I guess, amazed, humbled. So many people have offered words of encouragement and support, and just during this whole process of creating this series and starting this project. So it's been very, yeah, so it's been really good so far. So obviously there are people on the internet who will say things that you don't like, and you know, you have to pray for them as well. But you know, if you know that you're doing something good, you got to keep doing it. And yeah.
Strikes me that you need thick skin and determination to keep doing that. Thank you for sharing. I wondered, Andrea, if you could talk a bit about how self-expression can be a helpful tool in the midst of a difficult time, either a personal struggle or perhaps like something larger, like what we're talking about with the war in Ukraine. From your perspective and from a mental health perspective, like how do you think that art plays a role in healing us? Does it play a role in healing us, I guess I could say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can say yes. I think one of the ways that art really plays a role in helping us heal is that it allows us to release what would otherwise be pent up or kind of just hidden inside. So I often use the analogy of like a Coke can with clients, that if you're shaking up a Coke can, all of that pressure is going to build, and kind of the slightest prick will allow it to kind of explode. So our lives are kind of the same when we're experiencing a lot of stressors or challenges. A lot of things are happening externally. All of our emotions, it's like they're rattled within us. And if we don't find some healthy and safe ways to release that, it could come out unexpectedly or in ways that are out of our control. So art really provides us a safe means to release emotions, thoughts, questions that, again, would otherwise just be building inside. And I think the other way that art plays an important role in our healing and kind of processing is that it allows us to be witnessed. So we're allowing our story to be witnessed by others. And even part of the healing power of therapy is that there's a safe person that is seeing you, that is listening to you. So that's kind of what art provides, whether it's us allowing ourselves to be seen by those viewing our art or us seeing ourselves in the art that somebody else has created. But just that process of being seen and having our experiences normalized, having our experience recognized as part of a whole, that is deeply powerful and quite healing.
I think that Coke can analogy is good. And it reminds me, it's interesting, like Ivanka, your art is obviously nonverbal in a sense because it's visual. And then Andrea, you'd mentioned earlier poetry. And I think that's really interesting because I mean, that's true of my own experience. And like at the beginning of the pandemic, I also, and in stressful times of my life, that's when I'm most prolific. And it's often in the form of poetry, which isn't for me something that I do a lot of. I feel like I do it in periods and they're usually hard periods. And I wonder if there's just something to the fact that some experiences are extremely difficult to put into any form of rational, reasonable words. And so that's another kind of secret power of art, is that it kind of gets around that, but then we can still come back and look at it later and it starts to make more sense. I don't know if either of you have anything to share on that or further thoughts to add, but I'm just kind of thinking through that as I'm listening to you.
Yeah, there's a quote that I really like by Toni Morrison, and she essentially says that there are certain kinds of trauma and like chaos that are experienced by people that only writers have the language to be able to kind of articulate. So I agree with her, but I think I broaden that to say that only artists, whether it's with poetry or with visual art or with dancing, any form of expression that's not so bound by kind of grammar and proper language, that communicates and translates our human experience in a way that nothing else really can. So yeah, I definitely agree with what you shared.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of art, even in the written form, is that it can be interpreted in so many different ways. And so you might be producing something because you're being impacted by an event in your life, but someone else looking at that art, it might resonate with them for a totally different reason. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good reminder when, at least for me, when I overthink wanting to be sure that my art is going to be effective in a certain way. And then I remember that anyone can interpret it in so many different ways. And that's actually one of the gifts of it instead of a problem. I'm going to toss this to you first, Ivanka, but either of you can jump in. But how has art making for you, in particular in this crisis, helped you build a stronger relationship with God?
So I want to start by saying that I really liked what Josh said in his reflection at the beginning, where he says our role, well, hopefully as artists in general, but definitely as artists of faith, that our role is to expose the fallenness of the world, but also to visualize its redemption through hopeful imagination. I really love that. And it kind of brings me back to an article that I wrote for Love is Moving in April. So this was a couple months after the attacks on Ukraine began, where I kind of talk about how hope doesn't just mean optimism. It's looking at the beautiful as well as the horrifying or the horrible, and still being able to see the possibility of redemption. because of who Christ is and what he offers us every day, which is forgiveness and newness through him. And my favorite piece that I've made so far, and is it okay if I share my screen? Hold on. Let me see how to do this. Sorry, I am not a techie person.
Do you have the ability to share?
I think I do.
If not, I can make sure you do.
Okay. I see. Okay. Okay, so can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. So this is probably one of my favorite things that I've made so far in the series that I've been talking about. Let me see if I can, there you go. It's based off of this series of kind of happenings in Ukraine earlier on, specifically in Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine. So earlier on in the war in February, where a lot of babies were being born in metro stations around the city. And I just thought, like, what an amazing visual, symbolic image, you know, like these children are being born in the depths, you know, the literal depths of the earth. And also, you know, symbolically, like just these metro stations kind of symbolizing the depths of our despair, maybe during this time of war. But that this offering of hope, of new life, is kind of here. It's still there, you know, even in the midst of all of this. And so I really like that there's kind of this option of looking at it as, you know, just a regular mother and her child, or it could be Mary and Jesus, you know, as this kind of symbol or this beacon of hope amidst all this despair. I'm going to stop sharing. But anyways, to bring that back to your question, so even when I look at the news nowadays and come away feeling maybe depressed by what I see, deep down there's still this hope that I can come back to and rest in. And I think working on art pieces that really foster that sense helps to reinforce in me that, like, true and undying hope. So
I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Andrea, and just in your own experiences of, you mentioned some of the projects that you were working on, the poems that you were writing. Is there threads that you were able to kind of put together of how that's helped your relationship with God?
Yeah, I think I've grown up in the church. I'm a pastor's kid, so I've grown up around people often talking about how they've heard from God, and often it sounds like they're hearing an audible voice, or like it's just very clear in their lives how they're hearing from him. And I've always felt like that hasn't really been the case for me. I've never heard, you know, a voice or seen a burning bush or anything like that. So I think that's something that I've really wrestled with, and especially throughout the pandemic. And as I said, kind of the racial pandemic, it just felt like everything was negative and everything was heavy, and I wasn't hearing anything. I wasn't getting that voice of inspiration or hope. So kind of at the pit of that was when I wrote a poem called Give Me Fire. And it was essentially asking for what I had just said. I was asking God for a burning bush, or for him to do something very clear that would let me know that he was speaking to me, and that was his voice. It wasn't my voice or somebody else's. And then kind of through that process, I realized that it was a poem that God was giving me as a way of speaking to me. So I think my kind of journey in art has helped me to see that when I have an idea, or when I'm in the process of writing an article, that is one way that God speaks to me and makes his voice very clear to me. And I found a lot of comfort in that and encouragement to kind of continue walking in my unique lane with God, and not to look to other people to inform what my relationship with God has to look like. So I think that's kind of the biggest encouragement and growth I've seen in the last couple of years through my art, is just kind of solidifying, okay, now I know how God speaks to me and what my relationship with him looks like, that pattern of growth that I'm experiencing.
Like if we feel this responsibility to dig in and to process and to think through this, how do we maintain our like emotional strength and resilience through that? Maybe I'll get Andrea, you to start with that question.
Yeah, well, I think the focus of our conversation is to talk about the kind of purpose of art and the seriousness of art in times of difficulty and chaos. But I think art serves another function, in that sometimes it doesn't have to have a function. It doesn't have to have a utility, that there's a lot of joy and blessing in doing something without a specific goal or aim, or kind of this needs to serve this function. But that, yeah, just God has given us the ability to express ourselves, to enjoy art, to receive art, and to give it. And that it doesn't have to have kind of a utilitarian purpose. So I think that's kind of one level, is to engage in art just for the sake of it, not necessarily to have a key takeaway or a key kind of arguments that we're trying to make. And then I think the other part of that, again, is to have those boundaries in terms of the art that we create for ourselves, the art that is just our process of wrestling, and then the art that we share with others, and to be prayerful in the process of that, to be inviting God into just that process of kind of wisdom and discernment. And I think that's kind of part of how we protect ourselves, nurture ourselves. And then the last thing I'll say is to constantly be consuming things that are nourishing and enriching for us. The Bible speaks about kind of what we consume and how that impacts us, and how that will be poured out on those we interact with. So to be reading things, watching things, listening to things that are a blessing, that challenge us, that encourage us. What we fill ourselves up with will also pour out. So that's part of our protection and kind of our nourishment as well.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. And just to add to that, a tiny addition, that even just using our motor skills, just to sit down and to pick up a pencil and draw something, or sit down and or pick up a pencil and write something, or type something, that in and of itself can sort of begin the healing process, because God gave us bodies for a reason. We're physical, we're psychosomatic, we have a spirit and a body. So using that body can also act as the beginning of our way of working through and processing our art making. So
Yeah, can I just jump in and ask a question here? This is Josh. Yeah, I'm along those lines. Andrea, you kind of alluded to it, but we find that, like, in the last several years, there has been kind of a political turn in art, and there's very understandably a lot of anger, a lot of pent up frustration, and artists are releasing that through the art. So I guess what's your view on, kind of on the one hand, sort of this righteous indignation, but then being careful that our art doesn't become, I guess, too pointed or too shrill, where it then loses our audience, because it almost becomes a bit more like propaganda as opposed to telling a story, which I see in Ivanka and your work. It's like the work that you just shared. It draws people in. It doesn't immediately just send a political message. I'm curious what both of your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think we really have to investigate our motivations and lay those before God. So I've been taking a writing workshop called Spirit Inscribe, and the first week we talked about our motivations behind writing. And I think all artists can ask ourselves, especially artists of faith, what is the intention or purpose behind my art and behind this particular piece that I'm working on? And our aim, our goal should always be for the good of others and for the glory of God. So if I feel like I'm writing this to just prove a point or to show that I'm right or to persuade someone to believe something, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think we can kind of sit back and again, invite God into that process of really investigating our motivations. Is this really what God is calling me to do with my art? Is this the best way to steward my art and the message he's entrusted to me? So I think that's kind of part of how we can navigate that. And then also to recognize that to directly call out and critique is important and necessary for human flourishing, but then also to inspire joy and to celebrate is an important part of adding to human flourishing. Like I said, throughout the pandemic, I was watching a lot of hard videos and gathering a lot of information about systems and structures and racism and all of these really hard things. But then I would also make time to watch videos of Black families, of Black people laughing, of Black women enjoying themselves. So all of that combined was really a part of my process of learning. And the one without the other would have made for a lopsided learning experience.
Yeah, I think that sadly, propaganda art is so popular because people like to have something to stand behind, and they like to make their maybe political leaning.
I think you're frozen, Ivanka, unless, yeah.
Why you're creating what you are creating. And sorry, did my internet connection just cut out? Is that?
And do you want to just repeat what you just said?
Yeah. So I basically just agreeing with what Andrea said about really thinking about your motivation before you're producing a piece of art that, within the context of maybe a political setting or a war or something, something that could be taken as a political statement. And I had this interesting encounter with someone recently. She's a Ukrainian woman who recently came from Ukraine. And she came up to me while I was selling my artwork, and she said, why don't you create art that says things like F Putin or like, F Russia or something like that. And I said, well, first of all, that's not really my style. But secondly, I believe in I hope and pray for the redemption of every soul, especially my enemy. So I have to look at these people who are perpetrating these horrific crimes and really hope for their conversion. Otherwise, you really do fall into despair. So that was a really difficult conversation because she responded by saying, well, I don't believe that that if someone is capable of doing something so horrific, like what some of these war crimes have been, that is a real human being committing those crimes. So I think it's really a challenge to create art that really resonates with people without, like Josh was saying, without getting so pointed. It's important to remember the human being as the human being. And I think that maybe art comes across stronger if it is addressing kind of our core human nature rather than maybe a very specific, political agenda or whatever. So.
Yeah, so well said. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. I'm sure everyone has a lot of thoughts kind of in their minds after everything that we've just been talking about. So we're just gonna shift gears a little bit and we're gonna move into breakout groups. But if you have questions that you're thinking about or they get stirred up as you discuss further in breakout groups, like feel free to jot them down. We'll come back after for a brief Q&A. So if you want to ask a question to either Andrea or Ivanka, just jot it down, keep it in mind, and we can come to that later. I hope that you felt like you had enough time for the breakout groups. I think we're learning a little bit. Last time we were a little rushed, so this time we gave ourselves a bit more time. We're always open to feedback because I think the chance to actually connect with one another is really important and really at the heart of why we're doing this. So yeah, we're always open to your feedback. I'm going to pass it over to Nadine to facilitate a Q&A time. So if you have any questions that you've been thinking about that you'd want to ask our panelists, you can feel free to ask them now. And also, any one of you, like, please feel free to share your social media links anywhere that you want people to find you, whether that's on Instagram or you have a website. Feel free to share them in the chat with everyone just so that we can connect with each other. We can find out what each other is working on. So feel free to be doing that as the Q&A time is happening.
Yeah, thank you, Ilana. It was really nice having the breakout group. It was so nice to get to know people, talk to them, have conversation about art, or get to know them personally. Yeah, that was really beautiful. So if any of you have questions, feel free for the panelists, maybe you can message them to the chat and then I can read them, or yeah, the panelists could also answer the questions. Yeah, so I'm inviting everyone.
You can also unmute and ask your question, whatever feels most comfortable for you.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in. I'd love to ask just kind of if there's any predominant ways that you two kind of find your inspiration for creativity, or if there's any kind of practices that you have that you find kind of like get you in the zone to kind of, you know, start exploring creatively, or if it's just whenever inspiration strikes, or if you have a bit of a rhythm or a habit.
Sorry, is this a question for me specifically or for Andrea?
Sorry, for both of you, I should have clarified. Yeah, I'd love to hear just both of you. Thanks.
So, you know, I'm a really bad professional artist. I don't have a lot of consistency in my art practice. I usually rely on other people to provide deadlines for me. But inspiration is very strong, obviously, when I'm feeling something very strongly. So, you know, my direct connection with this war in Ukraine sort of inspired this emotion and this, you know, this feeling that I really needed to make something. And I think that sadly that's the case a lot of the time, is that some of the best art really comes out of suffering and pain, because, you know, you're feeling a lot during that time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
It's you, so it answers the question perfectly. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was sharing with my group as well that I'm like the worst example of what to do as a writer, that my writing process is very chaotic and all over the place. But I think I'm a very introverted person, but after spending time with friends and having discussions, that seems to be when inspiration comes, just out of what we've shared or kind of a theme that I'm noticing. And yeah, I think I tried to pay attention to the things that I'm consuming and just to see if God has set a pattern for me. If there seems to be kind of a certain question that everyone is wrestling with within my clients or within the shows that I'm watching, a theme just seems to come up, then that's a good indication that maybe God wants me to explore this, either just for myself or to share that with others.
Nice.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and asking the question. Yeah, we're open to a few more questions before closing. If not, I can ask my question. So I have a question for the panel. So in my breakout room, we were talking about how we find that most of the time we tend to learn and get more messages on the arts when we're feeling down. So do you feel like when you're down, that's when you do most of the art, when you articulate the art better than when you're happy or like when you're feeling good? So like how do you think that works with the way you're feeling? How does art relate to the way you're feeling when you're like making your art?
I think I tend to consume a lot more art when I'm in a good space mentally and emotionally. So I always have music playing, always watching something, reading something. So yeah, I think I'm consuming a lot more when I'm in a better place. And when I feel maybe more off kilter, or when I'm struggling a bit more, then that's when I'm kind of pouring those things out. So I'm creating a little bit more. I think the creative process is more challenging when I'm in a difficult place, but it's also fruitful. And then when I'm in a better place, it's not as painful. It doesn't feel as kind of tortured to get it out. But I think there's still fruit in that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a little bit of irony in that process as well, that when you are feeling that strong emotion to make something, sometimes you feel this pressure, right? But it's also a lot easier to create when you have less pressure, right? When you feel like you have time and you have the energy and you have the space. But I completely agree with Andrea that, yeah, it's funny how that happens, that when you're in a good mood, you tend to take in other people's art to kind of almost match your mood. Whereas, it's the opposite when you're feeling maybe down, like you said, Nadine.
Wow, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, any more questions?
Definitely want to embrace the awkward pause where people are thinking of their questions. But something that came up in our group, which was very interesting, and I feel kind of funny that I hadn't really reflected on this deeply before, is the relationship with beauty and suffering, and how turning suffering or expressing it in a beautiful form is actually one of the amazing parts of art, and why I think it's very important in the conversation of processing suffering, because there's something, like I use the example of the musical Les Miserables, and how like watching a sad story and yet getting chills at the beauty of the storytelling and the music and the singing is very different from just seeing a horrible news story playing out. So I wonder if either of you have any thoughts on that, the relationship between, and obviously not sugarcoating it in beauty, but how perhaps the relationship of beauty in unpacking suffering plays out for either of you in your work.
Yeah, that just makes me think of in Nigeria when like an older person or someone of stature has passed away, that the funeral is really a party and a celebration. So I don't know if you've seen videos of like the Ghanaian palm bearers who will be like dancing while they're holding the like casket, and there's like food, there's music, there's beautiful dresses. So it's not that it's not a sad occasion or that the family isn't grieving, but it's just that sense of this person has lived fruitfully. Let's celebrate the life that they've lived. And I think that's part of how that grieving and healing process is kind of facilitated. It's that sense of joy in the midst of suffering and pain. So I think even cultural practices can impact the way we weave that and see that beauty in suffering. I think in Western cultures, typically we like very distinct categories of something is happy or something is sad, like we keep them separate. So I think that's even a challenge that we can take, is how can we start to see the intermix between the two of them. And I think you see that all throughout scripture. of suffering and then joy, and Jesus sitting with, those who are ostracized in society and having a meal with them, and kind of the interplay of that beauty and that suffering.
Yeah, I also wanted to just mention that if anyone still has a question, they're welcome to ask it. But if any of you have thoughts of your own that you'd like to share on this topic, anything that you'd like to contribute, yeah, you're welcome to unmute yourself and do that.
Okay. Well, I guess there are no more other questions. Now I'll just pass the mic over to Josh for the closing and prayer.
Hey, well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you have been encouraged by our discussion and that you found it helpful, and that you also had a chance to meet some new people in the breakouts, and maybe have a chance to check out the links that have been shared in the chat. I know it's a great way to connect on Instagram and social media with fellow artists. I want to just extend a big thank you to Ivanka and Andrea for sharing your time with us tonight, for sharing your art, your stories, and also just your wisdom. There's been so many things to ponder. I know I definitely will continue to be thinking about what you've shared, and want to check back in with you to see how things develop in both of your artistic trajectories. Well, to close, I want to just read a couple of verses from Isaiah chapter 2. This is talking about the new creation. God will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, O house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Let's pray. Dear God, you are the great physician, the healer. You're the only one who can ultimately bring restoration to all the calamities that we're experiencing in the world today. We know that it's important to lament, and it's important to be honest about what's going on in the world, and not just sugarcoat it or be dismissive. We know that you also grieve, and you also are experiencing the brokenness that's in this world, and all of our experiences. But we know that we have hope from you, that we're called to be ministers of reconciliation in all the various ways. And so I pray for courage for the artists here, and that we wouldn't just devolve into despair at all, but you'd give us the confidence to be able to create the art that we're called to make, to foster relationships within the creative community, and to ultimately inspire hope in all of our creative endeavors. I want to specifically pray for Ivanka and her art and ministry through the Sunflower Project and humanitarian work. I prayed that more funds would continue to be raised for Ukrainian refugees, and ultimately, Lord, that this war would come to an end, and just that the killings would stop, that there would be peace again. And I also want to pray for Andrea and for her ministry and for writing and therapy work. Just give her the strength to persevere, and also the creative inspiration through all the work that she's doing. And lastly, I pray that we would continue to foster these communities of artists of faith who are able to build one another up in the times that we're living in. And I commit all of this in your name, Jesus. Amen. Hey, well, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and blessings to all of you. I hope you have a great week.